All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Entry Level Left. My name's Jared,
I'm Matt.
I'm Nathan.
and today we are discussing policing in the United States and abroad. So before we get into all those juicy details, let's go ahead and start with the basics. What are some historical examples of classical policing?
So, some historical examples. Let's go to this era, medieval Spain. We'll start there. So, we're going to give a brief sort of introduction to the policing in a historical context. So, by no means is this an exhaustive approach to the history of policing. There's certainly more to add. But as always, we'll put our resources that we do have in the show notes so that you can follow along there. But just to start off, like we mentioned, in medieval Spain, policing sort of started with this idea of like fraternal orders of armed individuals. And they were often organized for things like peacekeeping in municipal areas where kings could otherwise not offer adequate protection. And these groups primarily protected property against banditry. They patrolled roads, and throughout the Middle Ages, such like alliances of these fraternal orders were frequently formed by combinations of towns to protect roads connecting them, different areas of commerce or routes of commerce. And from that, you can imagine that different political ties or political purposes extended from those interactions between the towns and municipalities. Moving on from Spain, which is kind of like that basis of the medieval policing. So moving on to Germany, in the absence of strong state institutions, proto-vigilante tribunal groups like the Vehmet courts arose during the Middle Ages, and these groups mainly performed capital punishments and hung up corpses publicly to deter crime. So it's sort of a different approach than like the fraternal orders of peacekeeping and protection for commerce that we see in Spain. Although these were not mutually exclusive, there were different methods employed in different areas of all these different places in Europe, but those were stark contrasts to each other. So you have in Spain more peacekeeping elements with protection of commerce, and then in Germany you have these tribunal courts that arose to just basically enforce capital punishment and deter crime in a very negatively reinforced way. So in England, they kind of had this system of tithing. So tithing is sort of like a tax where you would be obligated to pay a certain amount for a private system of policing, where there was usually a constable or a sheriff or something like that. And they kind of led the police operations with sort of like a public tithing. But more commonly, local lords and nobles were responsible for maintaining power in their lands in like medieval Europe, and they often appointed like a constable or a sheriff, sometimes unpaid even, to enforce the law. And then eventually these constables or sheriffs became the first police official to be tax supported, like we mentioned with the tithing. There was also a system of investigative juries that was distinct from like maybe older or more feudal examples of police systems like in Japan, feudal Japan, where they kind of had things separate from the get-go, but this sort of idea of separating investigative juries or investigative bodies from the police was more of a European concept that emerged after. But it's important to note in like feudal societies in Japan and prior to the Middle Ages, you had a more, almost you could say a more progressive system where they had these bodies separated, where they had different bodies for different roles. And then in medieval Europe, the concept that is really important to illustrate is a lot of it was kind of just ad hoc on the go. They had the tithing, but a lot of it was not very centralized and not very organized in that sense.
So with all of that said, now that our listeners are a little bit more primed on the more medieval history of policing, what are some of the changes associated with modern policing that sort of bring us closer to today?
So the first centrally organized police force was created by the government of King Louis the 14th in 1667 to police the city of Paris, which was then at that time the largest city in Europe. In 1737, George II began paying some London and Middlesex watchmen with tax monies, beginning the shift to government control of law enforcement. So for many years after, there was a political conflict over whether police institutions should be public or private. So this is where you sort of see the ideology of law enforcement in state apparatus become conflicted between whether we should have a police force that's public or a police force that's privately funded. So this is around 1737 is where you see this ideology sort of take root, where there's an ongoing discussion of how this should be organized and how funds should be allocated to this enterprise. And this is sort of a big departure from the more medieval concepts of policing. So moving on from the 1737 example, in 1797, Patrick Colquhoun, a Scottish merchant and magistrate, was able to persuade the West Indies merchants who operated on the River Thames to establish a police force at the docks to prevent rampant theft that was basically causing an estimated annual loss of 500,000 Great British pounds worth of cargo. That's where you sort of see the debate continue on, where this public and private controversy is very much uptaken into the cultural dialogue. So the idea of a police force, as it then existed in France, like we mentioned earlier, was considered potentially undesirable foreign import to England, with Patrick Colquhoun. So I would say in England, they were more privy to this idea of privately sourced policing. So in building a case for the police in the face of England's firm anti-police sentiment, Colquhoun framed the political rationale on economic indicators. Like we mentioned, his whole basis or rationale was to establish a police force to stop this rampant theft of, cargo losses at the dock. So that's kind of how he framed his debate. But beyond that, he used these economic indicators to show that a police dedicated to crime prevention was, quote, perfectly congenial to the principle of the British Constitution. So they're sort of framing his idea for private policing in terms of like a British Constitution or a nationalistic sentiment. So as you can see, it sort of develops from this idea of just ad hoc policing to public policing in France, and then this idea is entertained in England, but the different locales and different national cultures or different ethics of these different cultures sort of clash with the idea whether they should be public or private enterprises. So finally, on March 12th, 1829, French government decree created the first uniformed police force in France known as city sergeants. They use a French word, of course, but, I can't pronounce it. So it just means city sergeants was what they were considered. So that was the first uniformed police force. And I think beyond that point, we kind of see the state apparatus consume or subsume this police force. So from that point on, you sort of see private police forces go by the wayside and publicly funded police forces by the state start to become the norm.
So with all of that, trying to connect the dots more so for our listener and transitioning to that more modern policing aspect, what social roles from all of that have police institutions played historically?
I think I would open it up to you guys as well, just to get your thoughts on it. But in my opinion, from what I understand about history and studying all these different things, I would say their primary motive is social control. If we go to examples of, even ancient societies, and I know, Nathan, you wanted to mention something about that, but ancient societies pretty much exemplify this idea that police forces were used for social control. Secondly would be protection of private property, explicitly private property, and then the use of legitimized force through a state or otherwise private authority apparatus. So these police forces, they are using force to enact laws or different rules, and that force is legitimized through a state or private power or private authority.
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful when we project our current values on ancient history, but we can definitely look back and realize that any sort of like organized police force, even going all the way back to ancient Rome, was designed to do two things, protect one, private property, including slaves, for example, or even just to prevent general turmoil. I think when like Augustus founded like the first, like the Proletarian Guard was there to protect him, right?
Yeah.
He created two other police forces, right? One was to stop general riots, right? Obviously to stop any kind of revolution, any kind of coup, any kind of like just general turmoil. And then he created a police force that was there to put out fires and essentially act as like anti-thieves and catch runaway slaves. So all these things are all concerned with just protecting private property. When it came to something like you getting injured because malpractice or something like that, there was no state protection for that type of thing. Anytime that you thought you had been wronged, you had to follow up prosecution on
Yeah.
your own. And that was, like you said, here going into the medieval times, that's been tradition up until Paris, really, was there was never really any sort of like state apparatus to help out the general public. It was never to actually protect the public. It was mostly just to protect, one, the ruling class, and two, any kind of like private property interest.
Even if we go back further to like ancient Greece, for example, a lot of the police force in ancient Greece was either conscripted or publicly owned slaves that were basically owned by these magistrates who basically directed what they would do. And a lot of their role was social control. But these police forces in ancient Greece, a lot of them were made up of publicly owned slaves or just conscripted people into a police force. So in the Roman example, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Romans used even components of their military to do police work. There wasn't really a distinction between the Roman military forces and the Roman police forces. And then in certain locales or areas where the police force was lacking, they would even pay private guards to do tasks like lookout, or even like in an early example when we mentioned Spain, medieval Spain, protecting commerce routes. I mean, private owners of capital in Rome would employ, private security guards in addition to military personnel who also did policing back in ancient Rome.
Yeah, I think, at least for me, how I typically think of this stuff, jumping more towards the future, is like even looking at examples, when we talk about the social roles of policing. I mean, I think there's even more modern examples with like specifically the US, for example, like the emergence of like large scale unified police bodies that effectively acted as slave patrols in terms of,
Right.
effectively herding up runaway private property at the time for the more elite farming, landowning
Plantation
class.
owners, yeah.
Landowning class of, America at that time. And then again, if you take a broader example, you look at across the rest of the globe, police were the armed wing of most colonizer societies,
And states, yeah.
colonized societies. And that, if you take South Africa, for example, it was like if you had a mixed child, right? Like half white, half black, whenever the police would come through the streets or
Yeah.
whatever to do their patrols, they had to be hidden because they would be taken away by the state, right? They were like this just armed wing of brutal authoritarian white supremacy, in a lot of these colonized nations. So there's always been this kind of deep-rooted history that links this authoritarian nature of policing with the state in many instances, but also in protecting the property and the establishment that rules over, whatever society it may be, from the Romans to the landowning class and colonizer societies, or in the United States, whatever the case may have been.
Yeah, and I think there is a definitive overlap of like the lineages of when we consider public police forces and private police forces. There's definitely an overlap, because if you think about slavery or slave societies, a lot of that property rights were sanctioned by the military or the state apparatus. So you see these apparatuses ultimately protecting property, whether they were employed directly by these property owners or not. So the lineages, they're definitely overlapping there. And as you can see, like over time, they become drawn out and separated from each other. But I think it's really important to note, to your point, Jared, these things developed because of that overlap between state enterprise and private property, and the interests that were established between the apparatus
Yes.
and the private property owners.
Absolutely. I think 100%. And I think that's transcended from that time to even today, where those societies that are largely ran by more wealthier bodies of power or groups of people, whether it's in slave or feudal societies, or even today, now speaking of capitalist societies, as we'll get into, those interests are always going to be intermingled with private property
Right.
relations.
Right. So I think that's a brilliant point, and we'll come back to it. But just for the listener, keep in mind that overlap in terms of those lineages of public and private are very important to consider for, the modern day when we start to get into the synthesis of modern capitalism with some of these elements of law enforcement. So moving on to the next section, what do you guys think is the general role of policing under capitalism?
I think first and foremost, again, as we had kind of just alluded to at that last point, if there was like one main point I would just get across, it's that policing under capitalism's purpose, no matter how many ways it may get convoluted throughout our society in terms of crime fighting and, whatever way.
Serve and protect.
Right. It's first and foremost to protect those interests that rule and govern the broader aspects of society. We are a capitalist country with a capitalist economy, and those capitalist interests bleed not only over into the ideological state apparatus, but also what Althusser called the repressive state apparatus, which are those elements of society that seek to crush and discipline dissent and nonconformity as well. So those could be everything from, yes, in some instances, people who steal or people who commit murder, but also in a much broader sense, people who organize labor unions that threaten the private property interests of X, Y, and Z corporation, and so on and so forth. While there's much more like in depth that could be said about that, and certainly more nuance and everything, I think that's what needs to be kept in the back of the listener's mind when we talk about policing under capitalism.
Yeah, so I definitely think that's a great point. Just something I want to add is, we talk about in modern times this idea that police are here to serve and protect. In a sense, yeah, I guess you could make that concession, but there's a caveat because, like we mentioned, in a capitalist society, there is endemic class hierarchy. So with the endemic class hierarchy created by capitalism, where you have a working class and an owning class, or the bourgeoisie ruling class, you have this character that this police state or police apparatus takes on as well. Because if, like what you were saying, Jared, to your point, if these elements of society are bleeding over and primarily they make up the most powerful elements of our society, like property owners, things like that, you're going to see a police system or a police apparatus that has a tendency to be biased towards property, towards ownership, towards these different things that make up the bedrock of the capitalist society. So it's not a conspiracy theory to say that, there are real, empirical reasons why you see police side with more reactionary elements or components or people in society. We'll get into that a little bit later because there's definitely more we can hit on that subject. But moving into the next section, how do we think liberals view police institutions compared to the left? Because we started to hit on it, but I think this is really going to just open up the can of worms.
Right.
What are the differences between how we would conceptualize police institutions versus how a liberal would conceptualize? And we talked about serve and protect, but I think it goes deeper than that.
Yeah. I think it's similar to the way that in many ways that we've discussed, like how liberals view, let's say, the economy, for instance, the reform, not revolution, kind of aspect. I think they take a similar stance with police. I think the liberal critique, if you will, of, let's say, modern day policing would probably be something along the lines of, they could even agree with the Black Lives Matter movement or something like that, but they may say it's only a few bad apples, right? It's just a couple, or it's some of the system is bad, right? It's not that, or even they could say that a good majority of cops are bad, right? But they never are really willing to get to a systemic critique of the system that births that very style of policing. And so I think liberals are often still under the impression that it's just a matter of changing a culture or getting body cams or something. And that sort of is going to be the switch that you have to flick to get policing to fundamentally and radically change in this country. But I think, it's more than anecdotal, but even if we just took anecdotal experience of black communities in the United States, from say post-civil rights movement to essentially up until the age of when we could, we had smartphones to film everything. It's so known, it's just been a known thing throughout like black communities across the United States, for example, that, police use a disproportionate amount of violence and policing of neighborhoods. And I mean, you see it, you can think of an area in your local community that's more heavily policed than others. And typically they are in black and brown communities. And what I'm getting at in saying this is that it's systemically rooted in the system. It hasn't even changed that drastically. I mean, it has changed in many ways, but not systemically, even post-civil rights movement, right? A lot of that carryover is still there because the system itself has not been changed.
Right. I think what we're getting down to is, if the listener is just now turning in and you're not familiar with the entry-level left, go back and listen to our episode on uneven development, because right there you'll see that we're trying to explain why this is structural and how disinvestment in communities, how underdeveloped communities on a very small scale can lead to more crime, and more crime can lead to more policing because the reactionary bourgeois state doesn't know how to handle these things other than just upping the policing
or stamping them out.
Yeah, they would never think of, things like reparations or economic redistribution or policies that actually fundamentally give people the power to change their lives and reduce crime in a very real sense. I mean, that's how the liberal responds to these things. They don't think about it in a structural sense, but if you look at history and you look at our episode that we did on uneven development, you'll see how these things are intrinsically connected. We'll go into it further later on. I know that's we've got a big section to talk about that planned later on, but just a little bit of foreshadowing, these things are intrinsically connected. If your community is systematically disinvested from, and, you are struggling to make ends meet, you may turn to crime, you may turn to drug sale, you may turn to different things like this. And then what is that going to induce in the bourgeois state? It's going to push more policing into your neighborhood. And that's going to create more crime and racial tensions and all these things. So all of these things have an economic root. That's what we're getting at.
Right.
So all of these things are rooted in economics and the way that history has played out. And even to a further point that we already made, these police forces in America were kind of started under this pretense, we're going to go catch runaway slaves.
Right.
So if you think about it from that context as well, not only is it economic, but it's cultural.
Mm-hmm.
These problems have been formatted culturally on our society because of conditions of our slave society, conditions of economic inequality.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a conspiracy theory to say, that these things not only are intrinsically linked, but they cascade and cause each other.
Mm-hmm.
So liberals need to step back and take a look at who does the police force benefit the most. Is it the people who own things? Is it the people who manage a Starbucks or own a big house in a gated community? Or is it the people who live in a poor, rundown apartment complex and are afraid to call the police because they don't know what their neighbors are going to say, or they don't know if there's drugs in the building or whatever. We live in a kind of a society where the poorer you are, the more afraid of the police you are. The richer you are, the more you feel like they're on your side. And you can see that it has racial undertones, but it also has classist undertones.
Right.
The people who are most likely to utilize the police aren't the people who need to be protected the most.
Right. The contrast is so deep that it's really police presence in urban communities or in poorer communities is typically associated with violence, like acts of violence. Am I going to call the cops for this genuine issue that I have? But are the cops maybe just going to get here and think I'm the person who's responsible and shoot me or whatever the case may be? Versus in more suburban communities or wealthier communities, police presence is almost like a comforting thing. It's like, this is, to protect. There's a huge class element there that I think can't be stated enough. And I think it's been hit, throughout just now. Yeah.
Even me, I mean, when I used to live in an apartment, a not so great apartment in Orlando, and I called the police, before they came in, they were like, "Are you sure you want to make this a thing?" They're like, "Are you sure you want us to come in and look around? You don't have anything that's going to, cause any problems?" And it's like, what kind of world do we live in where my house almost gets broken into? I call for help and they have to say, are you sure it's worth the trouble? You know, they have to
Right,
look
right.
at me and say, are you sure this is what you really
Yeah.
want to jump into? It's like, well, that's crazy.
Well,
you know?
exactly,
You're
and
on your own.
yeah.
You don't have the police. You can't rely on the police.
Well, that is an example of the class element, because in my opinion, from what that anecdote, what I'm thinking is like they're questioning whether you think your property is valuable enough to deserve their protection, right?
Yeah.
Or whether you think your family or your safety or your general safety, whatever it is valuable enough for their time. And that's kind of ridiculous, but like we mentioned before, this is not a conspiracy theory when we say that bourgeois society and police force have formatted each other and they work with each other because the owners and the most powerful people in our society benefit most from the police force. So you see that kind of, racial undertone, but a class undertone. And not only does that materialize in a very real sense, but it also creates this narrative difference between black and white communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even just white communities and people of color in general, right? So with that in mind, I think what develops is this idea, and we can use Black Lives Matter as an example, but this idea that like, when Jared talked about how people in rich communities or white communities tend to feel more safe around police, like they tend to feel protected. Whereas on the opposite side of the coin, the people that are disenfranchised or minorities, they don't feel that way about police. But what that creates is, like I said, a narrative difference. So you have people like Black Lives Matter who are saying the police are disproportionately targeting black people. And we're saying Black Lives Matter because our policing system and our justice system is everything they're telling us is that our lives matter less than our white counterparts or our rich counterparts otherwise. So that's the narrative that black communities and people of color get, whereas the narrative is completely flipped for white and rich communities. So it's no wonder how you get these people that are saying all lives matter, because, how would they know any better?
Right.
They don't experience what people of color experience. And that goes back into our last episode where we talk about white privilege. But ultimately, these things aren't just stories or anecdotes. They're real foundational problems. And this is a systemic critique when we look at the history of underdevelopment or disinvestment in communities. These things carry weight into the modern times. There is a real visceral and economic connection between disproportionate police violence against people of color and underinvested communities and, capitalism.
So moving on, what are some historical examples of policing in the U.S. that demonstrate police authority being used against the people's interest?
Right. Like one that I think of that I would point to is like the Haymarket Square massacre. But even before that, you have to talk about how prior to the events of the Haymarket Square massacre, you essentially had labor rights activists advocating for better working conditions, an 8-hour workday, absolutely insane, radical idea at the time, right?
In 19th century America.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So people advocating for an 8-hour workday, insane, too radical, can never happen, to the point where the protests are surrounding this turned violent when police shot on and beat up and killed a bunch of protesters, right? Which then led to the next day at another round of protests and events and all that. So it said protester throwing or bombing the police officers and killing police officers, who then fired on more protesters and whatnot. But it is skeptically looked at as to who actually threw the bomb, the protesters or the police. But regardless of that, you're talking about an instance in where people are advocating for the right to better working and living conditions, to better materially benefit themselves and sustain themselves without working themselves to death constantly. And who was there to swing the baton and bash some heads in and shoot, kill, and maim people in order to stop that from happening, right? It was not, these people's neighbors. It wasn't these people's school teachers. It was the police. It was the police. And who were they protecting in that instance? the corporations of the United States of America who did not want an organized workforce advocating for the rights and the benefits of working average people in the United States.
Right.
Period.
They wanted to make an example out of them.
Yes.
To put it simply. Just like if we go back to the Vehmic courts in ancient Germany, right? What we talked about earlier. They hung up corpses on trees to make an example and deter crime. It's literally the same thing here, almost 1,000 years later. You know what I mean? The means has not changed at all for the police.
Right. Well, and then on top of that, even if you move on from just working class issues, right? Or not that this isn't a working class issue, it's deeply tied to working class issues, but even when you talk about moving on in history to the civil rights movement, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Who was there to bash in the heads of the protesters, arrest and imprison MLK, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, whoever the case, name your person.
Who tried to get MLK to kill himself?
Right.
Wasn't that a...
Yeah, so it was a police force who knew of and did nothing about the lynchings, the burnings, the dismemberments, the bombings of black churches, black schools, black homes, etc., etc. Okay? The police force. And after all this time, a lot of these sentiments, while yes, they have improved, while they aren't as explicitly racist, the underlying systemic structure that allowed for that to ever exist, both the anti-worker mentality, both the racist mentality, and the fusion of the two and the reproduction of the two still exists to this day. And I think that's why it's so important to have these historical contexts when looking at where policing is at. Yes, historically, but how does that history move materially to where we're at today?
I mean, even recently, this month at Pride, we have cops who are escorting neo-Nazis and fascists to disrupt Pride. They're walking them into the parade to make sure that, oh, God forbid, the neo-Nazis get a little hurt at Pride Parade.
Or don't have their free speech.
Yeah, what was funny is that some of the police officers, at least in the photo that I saw, and we may be talking about the same article, but the photo that I saw, some of the police officers even had like rainbow
hearts,
pins on. Like some of them may have been, members of the gay community as well. But imagine how you would feel as it's such a weird combination to me to even be this. But imagine being a gay police officer defending neo-Nazis. That is capitalist realism right there.
But see, I guarantee you, they would. This is that liberal shit, though.
We said it last week.
This is that liberal shit because this is when. Let me tell you exactly what they would say to that. Well, I am so proud to live in a country that allows for gay people to march and the right of a neo-Nazi to literally ask for all of them to be politely genocided forever.
Yeah, right.
I said this. I think I said this literally last week.
Genocided.
I literally said this last week where it's that liberal saying where it's I don't believe in what you say, but I would die for your right to say it.
Oh,
or whatever
Voltaire.
The fucking bullshit ass nonsense.
Yeah.
It's that's what's going to get us all killed right there.
Precisely. That's what literally led to Nazi Germany.
That's basically saying that there is no moral high ground.
Right.
I mean, I understand, and we talked about this free speech debacle in a previous episode, so we won't belabor it too much, but it's essentially saying that minorities and people that, have historically been disenfranchised and oppressed, they are going to constantly have to argue for their right to fucking exist.
Right.
In the face of these fascists who are protected by the police, all under the guise of this free speech nonsense where all ideas in this postmodern kind of sense are equal and everybody's truth is equally valuable and valid, even if it's completely subjective, anecdotal horseshit nonsense.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter because under neoliberal capitalism, everything is equally valid as long as it's how you feel,
Right.
This is just nonsense.
Right. And it plays very much into the powers that be. As long as anyone can say anything and anything is valid, then at the same time, nothing is real and nothing is true and it's all fake news.
While we're on the subject, maybe you guys saw them, but one of my favorite memes that came out of this Pride season is basically the meme is like Mr. Krabs is being like Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob is being asked, what made you put up your rainbow flag or whatever? And in the second panel, he's just like money.
Right, exactly.
And I'm just like, yeah, that's pride in a nutshell for these corporations.
Right. The most ironic thing, okay, so you all know I was on a work trip last week. I walk into the hotel that I'm staying at, nice hotel. I won't say which family owns it, but not to give away my location. So I go in there, and there's literally a selfie booth in front of this giant fountain they have in the lobby, celebrating Stonewall. And it's like, all I can think of is
someone is profiting off of that.
And it's like all you think of is the, like, what was the group, the Queer Liberation Front or the Gay Liberation Front, and their quotes about, like, literally, we will never be free as gay people as long as capitalism reigns over this shit society. Or the fact that I'm scrolling down Facebook and I see a T-Mobile ad, which naturally T-Mobile changed the T to the rainbow flag, and it's literally T-Mobile sponsoring some dipshit face of gay whatever on Now This, talking about how important Stonewall is and how it's the reason why we all get to celebrate our diversity with all these different companies and their logos changing. And it was just like cancer incarnate, you know?
Well, yeah, we've talked about it before, but I mean, this is the psychology of capitalism. This is marketing, and this is what capitalism dictates to culture. Everything is co-opted, no matter how revolutionary or how radical it is. It's all co-opted. If it can be profited on, it will be profited on under capitalism.
Exactly. And just to tie it all back for the listener, what we're basically saying is, I don't care if in your local district, at a local level, I don't care if you live in fucking San Francisco's certified gay district and all the cops there wear rainbow flag uniforms.
Is that a thing?
And fucking ride around on rainbow unicorns. They do not in any way share your class interest at all. At all.
They're class traders.
At all.
Yeah, there's a reason why police are called class traders, because they wear a working class mask, but they don't get money from the working class, you know? They're not exploited in the same way that workers are. They're fundamentally tied hand in hand with the bourgeois state and the fascist reactionaries that basically want to see it all topple. And they have to protect the equal rights for both of those groups.
Right.
So they stand for nothing, basically.
And just, if you want to put it too in perspective, say you're maybe a little on the fence of this debate. Say you're thinking of, oh, well, what about, you know, the good cops or blah, blah, blah. Or you're, you know, maybe you're teetering on the brink of maybe democratic socialism, or you're thinking you're exploring socialism, but you're not quite there yet. Let me put it into even more clear perspective for you. If the cops have the choice between fascism or even democratic socialism, take a wild fucking guess which one they're going to choose. Or they may not explicitly choose it, but guess which one they're going to be doing the bidding for when push comes to shove.
Yeah, because ultimately, when a bourgeois state decays, ultimately those private owners or capital, they want their money to be worth something so that they can pay armed guards to keep the pores off of them.
Right.
And when it all like eventually dissolves and decays, these people are going to side with those who are going to give them the most resources, right? And of course, this is like a dystopian hypothetical. But what I'm saying is, like, if the people in general in a capitalist society are the exploited class, the working class, they have had all the resources divested from them by capitalists and owners of capital. And those owners of capital command all the resources. So who do you think that they're going to side with in that dystopian hypothetical? They're not going to just side with you because they think that the working class is just like the underdog that they need to support.
Right.
They're going to support people that can give them, you know, whether it's money, if money is still valuable during this hypothetical situation, or they're going to give them access to land and resources or food or whatever it is.
Or just power in general.
Just power.
And yeah, not even if it gets to like the fascist level of things, even if you're just looking at it from the economic level of things, like markets need some sort of security. You know, if there's general unrest, markets don't do well, you know?
Yeah.
So the police force, in a way, is a great investment. And the best part is it doesn't take much to convince the entire population to pay for a police force, when in reality it mostly benefits the upper class.
Right.
It's an externality to the capitalist class.
It's
they
yet
get the
another
most
subsidy.
protection.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen those articles before where Walmart, like they track how many police man hours are wasted at Walmart, for example, versus other mom and pop stores?
Mm-mm.
There's some great articles out there. I can't really name drop them right now, but there's ones that will compare how the most used police spots in one town will usually be Walmart, because
At a
there's so
Walmart,
many
yeah.
calls there. And so what does that mean? That Walmart has an unsafe location, and to make it safe, they're going to tax the public by keeping a cop station there essentially permanently.
Right, to protect
You know what I mean?
their
And that
Pampers
happens-
from being stolen.
And that happens on a large scale too. You know what I mean? People who are policing in New York during Occupy Wall Street, who's benefiting at that point?
Right.
It's not the people who are trying to actually make social change.
Yeah, name me
It's the
one.
people who are just worshiping the status quo.
Right, name me one instance of a police laying down their badge and their gun to join the Occupy movement.
Yeah,
Right.
think about what it takes for like a wealthy person to be arrested. You know what I mean?
Oh,
How many
exactly.
blind eyes get turned to people like that? Because when it comes to high-profile public people, police are always on their toes, you
Yeah.
know? And so they don't never cross the line.
The-
But if you're some no-name person and you're just getting pulled over, they'll do everything to push you right over into just spilling your guts and admitting you're guilty and sending you off to jail for
I mean, the treatment
life.
that they give you is definitely different. I mean, I think it goes without saying that people need to realize that there's a class element to police and law enforcement in general. Like it's so clearly there that it almost like it doesn't even need to be said.
Yep.
For us, at least. I mean, but people need to realize that that's why you see these rich people or these people that work in government or even the police officers themselves. They commit a violent crime. They say that they're defending themselves, and there's video evidence proving that, what they're saying is bullshit, but they still get acquitted. Or someone launders like billions of dollars and they get a 6-month sentence, or they get 6 years. Like, this is just a crazy example, but the guy who laundered all of that money or, defrauded all those investors in the Fire Festival, you remember,
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
that? That dude, I think his name was like Billy or something. But they made a Netflix documentary about this guy, and they glorified this dude. They gave him like 6 years in prison, but he got out on bail first for the Fire Festival, and then he started doing these like fraud campaigns where he would get people to buy these tickets to these expensive events like Met Gala or whatever the fuck it was. But the funny thing is like he didn't even go to jail for defrauding people millions of dollars. He went to jail after the fact for doing it again. Think if that was anyone else. Think if it wasn't like a prestigious person that owned a credit card company or a credit card membership program company that got rich off that. Think about anybody else doing that. If that was just some poor schmuck who, found a programming exploit but was a pretty much unknown and nobody, he would have got slapped on the wrist and probably done 25 years in prison.
Imagine if someone got busted stealing an extra or frauding the government for an extra $500 worth of food stamps.
Yeah.
Prison for years. They would either get an insane fine that they couldn't pay, or they would probably actually serve real fucking jail time. Now, if you collapse the entire world economy, you will see no jail time.
Yeah.
You'll pay a fine, if that. And the only time I've ever seen a high-profile motherfucker go to prison, it was Bernie Madoff. And why did he go to prison? Because he gypped off a bunch of other rich fucks. And that's the only reason that guy got jail time.
Yeah. I mean, smoking a joint in your living room has more risk than invading Iraq and
Right.
lying to the public and getting the U.S. to invade Iraq. These people can sit at the top and have just virtually no policing done to them whatsoever for actual heinous
Exactly,
crimes.
like Dick Cheney and Halliburton and all that, and all the people who profited off the Iraq war, the Abu Ghraib, the war crimes in the prison. I mean, none of those people will see any lick of justice for the most part. And even another example I was going to bring up when you mentioned what you were saying before, Jared, but the racial disparity is so clear as well. We'll bring up another example later, but there was a story, and maybe people recall, but there was a woman in Texas who voted while she was on probation, and she was sentenced to 5 years in prison because she voted while on probation because she didn't know that she couldn't vote.
Right.
while on probation. And by the way, this was a black woman.
Mm-hmm.
So think about like if you or me as like a white male did that, I guarantee you that I would not get 5 years in prison if I bawled my eyes out in front of a judge and said I didn't know.
Right.
I guarantee you that I would not do 5 years in
They
prison.
would find every way to say, "Oh, Matt was a straight A student. He did this,
Yeah.
that, and the other." Blah blah. blah.
And a star swimmer, you know.
Right. Yeah. Whatever.
Whatever.
Whatever they got to do. But anyway, with all of that said, we've gone into a lot of detail about policing and its relation to class and class development in society. And we've also mentioned some of the more liberal arguments about policing. But with that said, what do you say when people approach you and they say, well, what about good cops? Not all cops.
I mean, it's pretty simple. It's if you're a cop, you are enabling the people around you. You know, if you decide, not all laws are good, but I'm going to just enforce them all anyway. You know, does that make you moral? You know, does that because you're not as bad as the guy next to you? And if the thing is when you go look at these accounts, there's a lot of cops online who say they've witnessed heinous shit, and there's nothing you can do to solve it.
Right.
You know, there's nothing they can do that, or they at least they feel that they have no power to actually be able to solve these types of things. You know, and it gets even worse when you look at the police are policed by other police. You know, internal affairs is a completely corrupt system that leads to almost no prosecution every year. You know, it's just when it comes to cops, there's no kind of accountability. And until you have cops who are actually enforcing other cops, then what do you do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest point is like you mentioned, but just to make it really super clear, you know, if you're a cop, you swear and take an oath to basically uphold the law. Now, let's ask ourselves, are all laws moral? Are all laws ethical?
No.
Like there are definitely some laws that are unethical, right? Like some laws that are either like racially charged or circumstantially benefit owners of capital or circumstantially benefit certain social categories or certain types of people over others. You know, namely stand your ground laws routinely benefit police officers over people that are unarmed, right? And we've seen plenty of cases. I mean, I can't think of any examples right off the top of my head, but definitely there's a bias with that particular law or interpretation of a law. But quite simply, not all laws are just. Not all laws are ethical or moral. And you know, to just echo Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you know, in his letter from Birmingham jail, where he says, it is a man's duty, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's a man's duty to break laws that are unjust, right? And I firmly believe that, you know, with every fiber of my being. I believe that it is your duty to break laws that are unjust. And some would say, well, that's a gray area. Well, yeah, it is a gray area because that's your morality. That's where morality comes in. Morality is not consistent with law because law is only this interpretation or these subsets of interpretations, often without any critical analysis injected into them. So I would say, just condensing that thought, police officers agree to uphold all laws, not just the ones that they morally agree with or ethically agree with, but all of them. So if a single law is unjust or unethical, we can say that cops enforce laws that are not ethical. We say that a good cop, bad cop, it's bullshit. All cops are required to enforce the same law. It's not that they're an individually evil person or they're a bad person because they are cops, but because they decided to do this, because they decided to agree to police and enforce laws, some that are inherently unjust, there's no such thing as a good cop, I would say. Like, I would say all cops are bastards. That is the phrase, like ACAB, right?
Yeah.
People are, you know, some people on the left will be familiar with that. If you're not, you know, tuned into more leftist ideas, you know, that may be the first time you're hearing that. But that's why people say ACAB. That's why people say all cops are bastards. It's not because there's a problem with the individual police officer, but there's a systemic problem when all police officers are committing to enforce these laws without any individual moral or ethical analysis involved.
Yeah, I think the only point I really want to even add to this, it's actually a quote, and I'm going to directly quote from it. It's in a Jacobin article called The Bad Kind of Unionism, and it's by Shawn Gude. And we can put this in the show notes as well. But this quote had a really big impact on me when I first read it. And it says, quote, "It's easy to focus on the individual over the institution. Not a few police officers are drawn to the profession out of a desire to, quote, serve the public. Many genuinely want to serve and take great pride in their chosen occupation. Police don't have to enjoy breaking up protests. They don't have to be racist or hate homeless people. But once they decide to do their jobs, institutional exigencies overwhelm personal volition. When there's mass resistance to poverty and inequality, it's the cops who are summoned to calm the panic-stricken hearts of the elite. They bash some heads or infiltrate and disrupt some activist groups, and all is right in the world again."
Exactly. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. I mean, I took a lot longer to say what they said, but I said it.
But we got there.
We got there.
Oh, yeah. So, actually, going off of that, what are some reasons maybe why we don't support police unions then? Because we've talked about unions in the past and them being sort of an agency for working class folks to organize and represent themselves against otherwise, what's the word I'm looking for?
Like grotesque elements of like accumulated capital.
Yeah,
basically.
exactly. And so why would police unions be different from those kinds of unions?
So I would say just in general, police unions are very much institutions of capital. Think about who police largely protect, think about who largely funds police operations. And with that said, unions, we talked about in a previous episode, they're this way for working class people to come together in solidarity and basically, without sugarcoating it, demand things from the capitalist class. So are we trade unionists on this show? Not really. We think unionism is a means to an end. Like, we support unionism, but is it ultimately going to bring about socialism or communism? I mean, the mechanisms are there, but in a liberal sense with unions, I mean, liberals kind of just want to direct unions so that we're constantly begging for scraps off the capitalist table, like we say in the previous episode. So, I mean, unions are not the total solution there. But the reason we wouldn't support like a cop union or police union is because they're class traders. Their class interests aren't aligned with the rest of working class society, because we've already kind of touched on it, but we said, in a capitalist society, these elements in police institutions take on elements of class hierarchy from the capitalist class.
Well, I think too, like a major difference is like you take a teacher strike, right? Teachers are working so that they have less strenuous hours, higher pay, maybe some better benefits, right? For a job that is much more extenuous than just a 40-hour week oftentimes. And not only that, a teacher strike signals to other types of workers like hotel workers and manufacturing workers like, hey, I can do this too. I can organize for better wages and less strenuous working conditions and that sort of thing. Oftentimes when police are striking or advocating for or using their union to advocate on their behalf, it's to shadow them in greater secrecy, turn more of the accountability less away from the public and more internally within themselves, to protect one of their own who's guilty of multiple accounts of maybe abuse, corruption,
negligence.
That's what it's there. And those consequences have heinously violent effects on our society as compared to a teacher wanting higher pay. And again, I just want to quote, I know it's kind of a long one, but I just want to quote again from this article, again, The Bad Kind of Unionism and Jacobin. And speaking on this issue, the author states, "It's hard to imagine how it could be any different. Chicago teachers exemplifying the kind of social movement unionism that defends the working class broadly, organized the community before their strike by trumpeting a vision of equitable education. The left cheered. How could anything similar be achieved by prison guards? A police strike would appear to signal an incipient authoritarianism, cops untamed by democratic dictates. How could empowering police, increasingly militarized and shot through with a culture of preening brutality, yield anything but stepped-up repression? How could the traditional socialist goal of worker self-management result in anything but a dystopia of metastasizing prisons, imperious cops, and Minutemen-esque border patrol guards? The best we can hope for in police, it seems, is passivity."
Right. And I think, just as a caveat to that, because it's definitely something people will be confused about if we don't mention it. But the police, they are workers that work for a salary or a wage, and they do have to support themselves under capitalism just like the rest of us. However, there's a difference to their class character because of the state apparatus.
Mhm.
So that's important to note. In a bourgeois state, in a ruling class state or a capitalist state, the class character of a police squad or law enforcement institution is changed because of that. So that's important to note. Like, they're still workers, like they're still, laboring under capitalism like, workers, but because of the class character of the state for which they work, their interests are naturally going to be tied to that of the ruling class of the state. So they're workers, they're technically part of the working class, but they're class traitors in the sense that they work under a bourgeois apparatus. So that's the important distinction for people.
And they have far more protection from that
Right.
apparatus because of it.
I would say the one thing that I hate about police unions is that they're insanely effective.
Yeah.
They're really good at protecting their members. And every time you see a shooting, the first people to step forward and make sure that, the PR narrative is covered and make sure that everybody's all lawyered up is the police unions. They always have a table, whether it's a Democratic government or a Republican government, whether it's local or state, they always have a seat at the table to help shape policy. And what is the position of advantage that they have is that there is not a politician in the U.S. who is anti-police. So whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, you're never going to hear someone come out against a police union. And unfortunately, police unions have a pretty reactionary voting history.
Yeah.
They are constantly
Endorsing
helping out.
Trump.
Yeah, endorsing Trump, or they're constantly
exactly.
endorsing Republican candidates. And so it's pretty hard to politically assassinate a union when it has actual popular support from at least from the government. Yeah.
Specifically capitalists and a incredibly brutal and authoritarian state. I don't think it's any coincidence that when, say, the NYPD goes out on those training runs in Israel, where they practice, urban warfare type scenarios, I don't think it's any coincidence that there's oftentimes police union reps giving speeches at these, galas and all that sort of stuff, because they're so deeply tied to the state apparatus that is so deeply connected to these states that unleash unrelenting brutality among their public.
That even is the case where the LAPD does like drills in urban environments too. But what I think is even more interesting is that there are even police unions to begin with. I mean, that kind of represents an interesting development in American society specifically, because you see that like the labor movement and the unionist movement in the United States after FDR and maybe before as well. I mean, it was very strong. Like the labor union movement up until the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s was incredibly strong. And if you look at, I think we've posted the resource before, but if you look at the graphs of distribution of corporate wealth over the past 100 years or so from the EPI.org that we've listed before, you'll see that as union representation decreases, corporate share of profit in direct correlation increases. So unions are effective in garnering requests from the ruling class. But they're just not ultimately the solution. But really, because the police take on the bourgeois character of the state, because that's who they're aiding, that's why we say there is no such thing as a good cop.
Right.
So with that, moving on to the next section, kind of just really hammering this point home. What is wrong with this idea that reactionaries or more conservative people come up with about Blue Lives Matter? What is this and what's wrong with it?
Yeah, so Blue Lives Matter is sort of this direct, literal reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is, we had stated earlier, the Black Lives Matter movement is merely there to say, hey, we are being disproportionately targeted by police violence. Our lives matter just as much as anyone else's lives that you supposedly protect and serve. So in direct reaction to this comes this terminology of Blue Lives Matter, which is to say that cop lives matter, the blue bloods' lives matter, which they'll say is because they have a dangerous job and their lives are at risk, and like Black Lives Matter doesn't take into consideration the threat that they have or experience on their day-to-day job. This point has been so belabored now, like in a lot of like online like memes and shit, but like probably the most important point that I've heard made about this is like, at the end of the day, cops take off their fucking uniform. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
They're blue for approximately an 8-hour workday. Okay. Black people in the United States, black and brown people in the United States are born into this and they die into this. Like, this is from birth till death.
Yeah, they don't take the hat off,
exactly.
like they live with it.
Right. When they go into a gas station and the, clerk automatically assumes they're trying to steal, and at the slightest move of a hand calls the cops and the cops are there, that is a direct correlation to their skin color and their experience in the United States. Okay. Cops don't have any fucking thing like that. Cops don't walk
in uniform.
Yeah.
In uniform.
Cops in uniform don't walk into a fucking Walmart and someone says, "Hey, look, there's a cop," and then all of a sudden they start to look to fucking shoot at him or something like that. In fact, it's almost always the contrary. Like, you're sitting at a restaurant and there's cops in uniform there, and these reactionary parents send their fucking children over there to say, "Thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you for your service."
Fuck all of that. Like, there is any person who can consciously sit there and say and advocate Blue Lives Matter, that is a specific and direct reaction to a call for the recognition of the right to life of black and brown people in the United States. Those people that can say Blue Lives Matter in the face of that are fucking racist and reactionaries in the worst degree. It shouldn't be tolerated. It's absolute fucking bullshit.
And it's disgusting. I think a lot of them just don't know. They don't understand the context in which they're saying it. But ultimately, like you said, it's really that simple. Police officers take the uniform off. People that are born black or brown, they don't get to take that off. Like, that is their identity, and it carries with them regardless of what uniform they're on.
Regardless of education level, regardless of occupation. Like, all it takes is you could be, for instance, a freaking professor at a university and you're black, and all it takes is you to be driving down the highway.
That literally happened.
Yeah.
There is an example of a guy being profiled, and he was a black man who was a professor at a university, and he was profiled, and I'll see if I can find it for the show notes, but this stuff literally happens.
There's that one too, the state attorney, that she was black.
Yeah.
And she got like pulled over and she's just like, "Are you profiling me?" And they're like, "What are you doing here?" And she's like, "I'm the state attorney." And they're just like, "Oh, okay, goodbye." And they turned around and walked out. It's like,
Yeah.
You're even profiling your own people.
Right. And that's the thing. It's like, for police officers of color, there's like this internalized racism, or this internalized idea that people of their own race are more prone to crime, or even reactionary arguments that'll say, these populations are just more prone to crime. Like, Trump and all his conservative friends will say, well, in this municipality or this city, I think they did it to Gillum, didn't they? They said in Tallahassee, there's just so much crime. Look at what Gillum did here with this Democrat presiding over this constituency here. Look at all this crime. And
they say the same, and then look, Chicago. It's always Chicago.
Detroit too.
Which anytime you hear Chicago or Detroit, just for a listener, just change the language immediately to black, because that's what they mean. When you
it's a dog
when you
whistle.
hear Chicago or you hear Detroit, it means, and they say people in Chicago or people in Detroit or anything like that, they mean black.
And just to like make this completely clear for people that may not, have yet listened to our uneven development episode or our episode on imperialism or anything that kind of ties back, and even our episode on neoliberalism, which kind of formatted this idea of like individual critiques to structural problems, yet like the good cop, bad cop thing, that is uniquely a neoliberal ideological remnant when we think about those type of independent or individual critiques. But just to tie this all home, like, these problems that we talk about, like these communities or these people or populations that conservatives think are more prone to violence or more prone to crime, look at the structural reasons for that. Look at redlining. Look at white flight from these communities. Look at disinvestment. Look at all of the stuff we talk about in our episode on uneven development. this is the legacy of these problems that still exist. It's not because these people inherently are more prone to crime or black people want to kill each other. Like, it's completely and in totality an economic scenario that has formatted culture to be that way in the first place. So don't believe these individualist, nonsense, reactionary, right-wing critiques about these particular people or populations being more prone to crime. When we talk about the caravan having ISIS members in it, it's all a dog whistle. It's all bullshit for them to distract you from the real structural problem, because they know an educated populace is going to look at these problems, look at the history, and say, well, something is kind of fucked up about capitalism, don't you think, if it reproduces these structures in our society over and over throughout the years? They don't want you to think that way. And it's not a conspiracy. Look at all the information. We're making this so that people are convinced of these things. But just to draw your attention to, an example that we want to really highlight here with the disproportionate sentencing or the disproportionate use of law enforcement against people of color, I'll bring up an example of a man named Mohammed Noor, who was a police officer, but he was also a Somali American black man who served as a police officer. But basically, in responding to a 911 call, he went out, and I think he was with a partner, and he went out and responded to the call, and the woman that they were responding to her call basically came up upon them in a dark area or a non-lit area and basically startled him. His first reaction, probably inappropriate reaction, but a reaction nonetheless, was to shoot her. So this woman, who was a bride-to-be, got shot, right? And she inevitably died from the gunshot wound. And this man got 12.5 year sentence in prison for this incident. So, I mean, obviously a horrible incident. The woman didn't deserve that, and the guy made a mistake. The police officer, Mohammed Noor, made a mistake, and he definitely should not have done that. You can say that he didn't react appropriately, and I definitely agree with that. But, 12.5 years for a cop is kind of unprecedented. Like, maybe if it was someone who was not a cop, yeah, that makes sense. But by and large, we see cops acquitted for these things because the state takes their side. They say it's an accident. They say they were defending themselves or they were startled. When the cop shoots the chihuahua, that's something I saw in the news today. Like, a cop shot a chihuahua because he was afraid of it. I'm like, are you kidding me? This is like a dog that's not even a foot tall.
Right.
But anyway, I digress. Back to this sort of like this foil situation that I want to bring up to Muhammad's case. But there was a cop in Oklahoma named Betty Shelby, and they were a former Tulsa police officer who fatally shot a black man named Terrence Crutcher in September of 2016. So this police officer, Betty Shelby, said that they basically shot this man, Terrence Crutcher, in self-defense. But there was video evidence of the shooting that showed the suspect, or Crutcher, holding his hands above his head. So he was not a threat, right? He was, from what I can tell, unarmed. I don't know the full details of what happened prior to the video, but the man was unarmed and not a threat. He had his hands in the air right prior to being shot. And then this officer, who was a white police officer in Oklahoma, was completely acquitted after shooting this man. So, I mean, the contrast is like white female cop shoots black man with video evidence that it was a disproportionate use of force and response to the situation, where you have conversely a situation with a black male cop shooting a woman in what he says self-defense with, from what I can tell, no video evidence, similar to the case with Betty Shelby and Terrence Crutcher. And then the black man gets 12.5 years for a similar crime, whereas the white woman cop is completely acquitted. Now, you could say that the woman that Muhammad killed was pregnant, and then maybe that reinforced the jury's decision. But, in a lot of these cases you have to look at, and there was one case where recently a man was sent to prison for like an absolutely ridiculous sentence for just kissing a white girl who was underage in a club. Did you guys hear about that? It's just ridiculous. Because if you look at cases like that, he wasn't even judged by a jury of his quote unquote peers. It was all white people.
Right.
You know what I mean? And in a lot of these cases, the same thing happens. It's not a jury of the peers, and so the sentencing is disproportionate when you look at these cases that are identical for the most part, except for like these very acute details and these racial differences. So, I mean, of course, that's not an example or two examples that you build an entire philosophy or ideology on, but those examples aren't the only ones of these disproportionate uses of force and disproportionate sentencing on racial lines.
Right. So with all of that said, what might an alternative to modern policing look like or take the form of?
I mean, we could just point at all other countries, possibly, who don't have such a militarized police force. That's probably the first major step we should take is there's plenty of countries who have a very successful policing, and their priorities don't rely on like tasing people or shooting people or tear gassing people. I mean, even look at a very, very densely populated and semi-violent place like London, and you realize that you don't need guns to always be in control of a city. You know,
Right.
You don't necessarily have to have an armed police force, and that would at least be a step, to alleviating some of these problems.
Yeah,
in the short term, of course.
Yeah, so I think I agree to an extent. Like, disarming the police is a huge step in that direction. Not giving them literal fucking tanks to go in, in cities that are rightfully rioting at the shooting of unarmed black children in their communities. But not to say that those, countries don't have their own systemic issues with policing historically. But I think the element of disarmament of the police is an effective one. I think, too, just in my personal opinion, community control of policing, which I at least envision as being like police forces that are held almost the same way I have to in my job, right? I have a citizens advisory council. I have a council of my peers. I have a board of elected officials. All of these things judge what I do before any plan or thing that I do at my workplace can go into effect or in any form of action. It has to go through the public, my peers, and a board of elected officials who are elected by the public in the community that I work for. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of steps that have to happen. And so to me, transitioning to that form of community policing, where there's a lot more public and political oversight, I think is another huge step in the right direction towards a more reflective community style policing in which the people who are doing police work or engaging in policing are representative of their communities and their community's interests.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree. I think disarmament would be a first step. I don't think the police should have weapons like that. I don't think that they should have handguns. I think that a taser is sufficient in most situations. Now, a SWAT team may be different. There may be reasons for a SWAT team, but I think generally, we should demilitarize the police. Police officers in the U.S. kill hundreds of people per year. That would be a first step, in my opinion. And then second, like you say, my ideas aren't too different. I want the policing to be representative of the community. Ideally, I want the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and their state apparatus, and I want worker ownership of the means of production, and I want a police force that represents the workers or the working class. But I want a solid gold toilet, but that's just not going to happen. So, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. But anyway, the final thing that I would add on to Jared's thing would be just this idea of like community policing and mutual aid. So like really going to a radical element where you have like example in like the Black Panthers who would patrol and police the police in their communities. So I think that's sort of like a democratic, and you could say it would like create splinter groups or make fringe groups. But I think if they're centrally accountable, they can hold each other accountable without too many problems. But I just think more accountability, disarmament, and more encouragement of communities to police themselves and just not call the cops. Like if you can de-escalate a problem without calling the cops. Like too many people in this country call the cops for the most minute and smallest issue. And I think that needs to change. Like our cultural attitude toward the police needs to change. in that we don't call them for the smallest things, where like a black girl is like selling lemonade on the corner of a street,
Right,
or
right,
like a little kid is selling water, water bottles. And
right.
then, this crazy white woman is calling the police on her. So that's really what I would like to see in terms of a shift away. With all this said, we've talked a lot about many different things that, again, on Entry Level Left, we want this to be sort of an ongoing discussion for all of these topics. So while in these like individually named topics on their episodes, their corresponding episodes, we want to give you like a very bedrock foundation with which to work with and to understand the ideology of Marxists or socialists or otherwise leftist thinkers. But we do that in a way so that you can understand going forward why these things connect with each other. So to that end, how do we think that a legacy of colonialism, imperialism, and uneven development, as we've seen in the US or even the global north as a regional example, how do we see those things intersecting with racial prejudice in modern policing?
I think we've hit on a lot of like, how colonialism, uneven development sort of intersect with like the inequalities of policing and such. But all of those things have one major thing in common, which I think is systems and broader systemic forces being at play in the role of, where we're at today, and essentially like the modern development or the modern movement of history to where we are currently as it relates to material issues. And so when I think of this question, it brought me to this article I found by The Guardian that highlights a study that I want to read from to highlight some of these systemic factors. So discussing a UCLA, Harvard, and UC Berkeley affiliated study from researchers from these universities, and they calculated that basically people of color had comprised 38.5% of the population, but 51.5% of the years of life lost due to police violence. So to put that in a little bit more perspective, according to the study, which was published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health, there were approximately 57,375 and 54,754 years of life lost in total due to police violence in the U.S. in 2015 and 2016, respectively. So hear those numbers, and then going back, think again that of 38.5% of the population, which is black, 51.5% of the years of life lost out of all those years was also comprised in black and brown communities in the United States. So for context, the article states that those figures are roughly the same as the years of life lost to meningitis and childbirth-related deaths each year. The figures for police killings are higher than those due to both cyclist road injuries and unintentional firearm injuries, according to national data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So basically, putting all that in perspective with systemic issues, had this been any other issue, had, Hep A or something been causing an issue so gravely impactful as this in terms of leading towards effectively the systemic destruction of certain elements of society and specifically certain people in society, I think it highlights this continued systemic eradication. So it's not only a long-term, underdevelopment, it's kind of highlights this long-term systemic eradication of particular elements of society that are rooted in police structures and police forces in the United States.
And I want to add to that point, between 1980 and 2015, the number of people incarcerated in America increased from roughly 500,000 to over 2.2 million people. So beyond that, with those racial disparities in mind that we talked about, as of 2015, African Americans and Hispanics make up about 32% of the U.S. population, but they make up about 56% of the incarcerated population in the U.S. So, this is an epidemic. This is not just an individual problem with these communities or these people. This is now, at this point, something that we can call an epidemic of disproportionate police violence and repression against people of color and communities of color. As we've reiterated throughout, these legacies, the first legacy that we talked about tonight was the legacy of public and private police institutions and their development throughout history, their intertwined legacy, and how that instituted this sort of police state that has a very intrinsically bourgeois character, especially in the U.S. So that's why we say cops are class traitors, like all cops are bastards. That's why we say that stuff. So beyond that, we can see that uneven development, colonialism, imperialism, all of these things have direct material ties to this epidemic situation that we see today. We're going to continue to talk about this, but we want you guys to be aware of these things before we start getting into, the prison industrial complex or for-profit prisons, which we'll get into in our next episode. But just be aware that this is now an epidemic proportion. It's not about all lives matter. It's not about Black Lives Matter. What the issue is that this is a very real problem. This is epidemic, and we can't deny it anymore that these people in these minority communities are being disproportionately targeted by the repressive bourgeois police apparatus. So to a lot of us, it's, undeniable, but some people may not be convinced. So, I would just recommend that you continue to stay tuned for our next episode. And with that, I hope you guys have a good night. If you want to check us out on social media, you can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook, The Entry Level Left, and we're on Twitter at Entry Level Left. We're also on all major streaming platforms. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Apple. You can find us on Google, iTunes, YouTube, like I mentioned, Stitcher, CastBox, Pocket Cast, all of those. So anywhere you want to find us, please like, subscribe, tell your friends, give us a review. Any of that helps. We really appreciate you guys listening to us, and always let us know if you learned something. If you have a comment, you can always reach us on our Facebook page or just get in touch with us any way you can. And until next time, this is the Entry Level App.